Hi, I'm here to tell you some stories about my famous suffragette grandmother that helped raise me. She was born in Pueblo, Colorado, and raised on one of the first cattle ranches in Colorado. And under some very tragic and dire circumstances, her mother died when she was 10. Most of the mothers in that valley did not live to raise their own children because they didn't have running water, toilets, all the conveniences that we are so used to today. Her mother took her to see Susan B. Anthony speak from the back of a wagon that week, right before she died. And Jessie looked up into Susan B. Anthony's face and remembered thinking to herself, I want to help women. I want to be just like Susan B. Anthony. Eventually, a wonderful teacher that Jessie met in high school helped her get into Smith College in New England back east. And her father wanted her to stay home and feed the ranch hands and to do all the housework. And the teacher said to him, she's already stressed from losing her mother, and she did lose her stepmother and her little sister and her brother. Tragedy after tragedy. And the teacher said to her father, she will be dead in a year if she doesn't get out of here. So he eventually sent her off, paid her way, gave her some money for a wardrobe, and she was off to Smith College on the train. After Smith, her first job was to help Professor Cunliffe put together the Pulitzer School of Journalism at Columbia. For some reason, she always ended up in the center of major events. Her next job was to help set the first minimum wage for women in Boston. When Boston did a thing, then the rest of the country would follow suit. So after that, they sent her down to Washington, D.C. to become the first woman lobbyist, the first official woman lobbyist. And she was sent there to set the minimum wage for the entire country from $4 a week to $8 a week, double, if you can imagine working for either one of those salaries. And her first job was she was going to have to greet and talk to a very gruff senator to get him on her side to help the minimum wage bill go through. And he was known to think that women's only job was to stay in the home and do housework and raise children. So she dressed up, went into his office, and the secretary wasn't there, so she went right into his office. And he looked at her and he said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "Well, Senator, I have come to ask you to help us get the minimum wage bill through for women." And he said, "Why aren't you home having babies?" And she had to think about this because the whole bill may have hinged on what she said next. So she said, "Well, Senator, it's customary to have a husband before having babies, and all the good men seem to be married." He laughed and he said, "Well, then I'll have to help you." So then she explained the whole bill to him and what she wanted him to do. And suddenly he looked at her again and said, "What do you do for recreation?" And she told him that she and her friends canoed every weekend up and down the Potomac. He got very excited and went on for half an hour about his boyhood exploits in Kentucky, doing swimming and canoeing and fishing. And then he said, "What's the date you want?" And they set a date together on his calendar. He came in and got the bill through for the women. It was a very big day for all women in America. And then he told her he would help her whenever she needed it to come to him, and he would help her. Believe it or not, back then in the 1910s and teens, anybody could go down the halls of Congress, find a meeting, and go in. You could even speak at them, if you can imagine, unless it was a closed session. So Jessie was going down the halls one day for her job, and she saw a huge room, and they were having a meeting, and she went in. It was the meat packers. And they were trying to take the meat packers to task because they were kind of like Chicago gangsters and would have people bring their cattle to Oklahoma cattle yards and then not pay them or pay them less. And she knew this story well because her father, as a cattleman, had sent his cattle to Oklahoma by train And when they got there, they offered him such a low price, not the price promised, that he lost his shirt. The next year, the cattle wandered into quicksand and sunk. So he went into real estate. So she wanted to expose it, but she knew none of the newspapers would put an article in because they all ran huge meatpacker ads every day. So she wrote up an article in her perfect Pulitzer School of Journalism manner that she had learned at Columbia and took it down to her friend who worked at the Christian Science Monitor. Back then, that was a very big paper and influential. And because they didn't have the ads in their paper, she could run the article. So day after day, Jessie went in, attended the meeting, brought in the article to her friend who ran it, and pretty soon everybody started noticing what was going on. And then Jessie started bringing in a whole coalition of women to sit there and watch them, which made them very nervous. And another man started printing the articles. And pretty soon President Wilson had to pay attention and make a law to stop the meat packers. She met Alice Paul, who was her same age, and she would have lunch or dinner at Alice Paul's house right across the street from the White House. Alice Paul served lunch and dinner cafeteria style to all the women who were working with her. She had a benefactor that helped pay her way, but she was also a Quaker from a very wealthy family. And she had just attended the London School of Economics and came back after meeting Emily Pankhurst with the militant form of suffrage and gathered a group of women. They always tried to get Jessie to join them, but she was a parliamentarian and didn't want to do the militant way. And she met Carrie Chapman Catt, who was older than both of those two young women, who had worked with Susan B. Anthony for 30 years as the young woman in her group. And when Susan B. Anthony retired, she handed the baton to Carrie Chapman Catt. So at first, Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt worked together, but pretty soon they divided almost violently, not liking the way each of the other was going to conduct the suffrage movement. But Jessie always said, without both of them, we may not have gotten the vote as soon. We needed the militant and the parliamentarian version of it. So then Carrie Chapman Catt took Jessie with her when she spoke all along the West as a second speaker to get each state to ratify. They had 35 states ratified and they needed one more for ratification. They needed 36, and it all came down to Tennessee, a southern state. And everyone convened in Nashville, Tennessee, when the governor finally conceded on doing one more vote. Everybody came, the liquor coalition, the meat packers, the steel industries, all the lobbyists who didn't want women to get the vote, and Carrie Chapman Catt and her women. And they were kind of taunted while they were there. It lasted for days. And they were spit upon and they were jeered at and their mail was opened. But they persisted and stayed. And that last day, the vote came down to one young man, Harry Byrne. He was the youngest senator. And he, at the very end, voted for ratification. And all the men came up to him and thumped him on the back and said, "Why did you vote for it? You weren't supposed to." And he said, "Well, I got a letter from my mother." And here's what the letter said. "Dear son, hurrah, and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against. They were bitter. I have been watching to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification. Your mother." So, because of one humble farm woman in the hills of Tennessee, 17 million women won the right to vote. Well, the newspaper men got very excited and rented cars. They all didn't have cars, and headed for the hills to her farm. She was coming out of the milking barn with 2 pails of milk, and she invited him into the kitchen, sat him down at the table, and served some baked goods she had made that morning with the milk. And they asked her, "Why did you write that letter to your son?" She said, "Well, in the winters, they're very long here in the hills, and we're always reading Shakespeare. And Shakespeare is always funning with words, so I thought maybe I could fun with some words. And that is how 17 million women won the right to vote. Now I have a short video with a lot of the rare pictures I have found in the archives. About 2 years ago, I started going through my grandmother's archives that were sent to me decades ago. And I found her memoir and lots of rare pictures, and I thought this should be a book, so I started making it. And 2 months into it, I realized the 100th anniversary was coming up, so it was very serendipitous. And so here are some of the pictures, and I put 94 in the book, and I left a lot of them out. There's even some letters from Carrie, Chapman, Catt, a letter from George Bernard Shaw, all her instances with Eleanor Roosevelt, who she spoke beside later on, and pictures of her with Gloria Steinem and Marlo Thomas, who she spoke with in her early 90s and took me along.